Hello and welcome. My name is Sankalp. If we haven't met, I am a neuroscientist. I recently completed my PhD in psychology/neuroscience from the University of Oxford. Having said that, it's worth emphasizing that this work on the internet is separate from my scholarly and research roles at the University of Oxford. Now we shall talk about dopamine. So, in the last few live streams, in the last few episodes, so far we have learned that dopamine is involved in learning and decision making. We have seen how where it is produced in the brain and which parts of the brain are involved when we talk about dopamine. And we have also seen that, let me center myself here. Um, and we have seen what we can eat that leads to dopamine, and what are the functions of dopamine in terms of energy, in terms of motivation, in terms of decision making, and how does it keep track of your environment, the context that you're in. So what we are going to do today is talk about practical things. We are going to talk about what do I do if I want to improve my energy, if I want to improve my vigor, if I want to be motivated and driven and pursue those long term goals without feeling that I am staying behind or lacking behind, or without feeling that, I do not understand how this machinery works. And really, the purpose of these videos has been to figure out how does this machinery work so that hopefully we can use it and leverage it to our understanding. So in case you're new here, you will notice, well, that's not what you'll notice. You will notice that there is a bit of a whiteboard setup I have here, so I can write things down. And what we are going to talk about today is really two things. So we are going to talk about some illnesses so that it helps us better understand what dopamine does. So we are going to, for example, talk about Parkinson's. So this will help us understand what dopamine does on a more practical day-to-day level. We will talk about things like addiction. We're going to talk about things like mental health slash the illness that dopamine seems to be most involved in. And again, this is to understand what dopamine is doing in our day-to-day lives. And just to ensure I'm not outside the frame here. And the fourth one we will talk about ADHD. So in all of these illnesses, there is a role of dopamine involved. Let's see if I have anything else to cover. So we will talk about these illnesses, and then we're going to talk about how is dopamine involved in besides these illnesses. So how can we take the lessons of how we know it's involved in these illnesses, plus all the theory and concept that we have been learning about dopamine in the last few lives. And again, if you're new here, don't worry too much about not knowing what we did in the last few lives. I'm going to try and make this very, very practical. So we're going to then talk about what foods can we eat even if we do not identify or have any of these health related problems. And if you do have any of these, then hopefully it will also help you understand your situation a bit better. Of course, all the usual caveats go that I am not a psychiatrist. I do research psychiatry, so I hopefully should be able to talk about it with some level of expertise. But know that obviously I'm not here to give you direct medical advice, and that is something that only a healthcare professional should be able to do. Okay, so what we're going to do is, before I start telling you, how dopamine might be involved in Parkinson's and addiction, schizophrenia, ADHD, and then what should we do on a day-to-day level if we want to increase our motivation, if we want to increase our energy and vigor. Before I do any of that, it's important to start with this caveat that it's not as easy to go from an understanding of neuroscience to immediate application. There are not lots of neuro influencers out there who peddle neuro BS, and what they make it seem like is neuroscience has progressed to the point that you can just read a study and then make like generalized conclusions about what we can do in day-to-day lives. That largely is not the state of the field right now. Like, we're surely developing a lot of understanding of how things work, how dopamine works, how energy works, how motivation works. But that doesn't necessarily mean that once we understand how it works in rats and mice, now that we can just tomorrow have some prescriptions on how do we use it for our day-to-day lives. That's certainly not the case. So so whatever we are going to talk about today in terms of the application, especially after these talking about these illnesses, is going to be a bit more art than it's going to be science. Like, I do feel as a neuroscientist, I should be constantly thinking about how does the science that we do apply to day-to-day lives. And that is my interest. Like, I'm interested in the translation. But know that that doesn't mean the field has like definitive answers yet. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be a bit more on the art side, a bit more on the personal opinion side, and not necessarily, just neuroscience says this. And hopefully me saying that as a neuroscientist means something, so that when you look at other neuro influencers, you have a little bit of your guard up and you demand the science behind why they're saying what they're saying. Okie dokes. So, looking good, all looking good. So, what we're going to do now is we shall talk about these illnesses and the role of dopamine in these illnesses that we just talked about. So, when we think about Parkinson's, one of the first episodes of dopamine, I talked about dopamine's role in movement. And again, this is how it can, we can think about how dopamine is involved in our day-to-day lives. So if you don't know, first of all, Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative illness, meaning it's a disorder that we can trace in the brain. And it's related to degeneration, meaning it often happens with age or just, entropy, like things getting older and it degrading, degenerating, as the word suggests. And so Parkinson's is a movement disorder where you will see that people have like massive tremors as they walk or just, function in their day-to-day lives. So if you ever seen someone who's slightly old, who perhaps like has shaking and, they can't walk carefully or they can't hold something very carefully or properly, then chances are there is some sort of Parkinson's involved. Again, make a diagnosis. Obviously, normal weakness is also part of the aging process. So that doesn't mean anyone whose hand is shaking might have Parkinson's. But the gold standard, the diagnostic of Parkinson's, what we know about Parkinson's in the last few years and decades of neuroscience research has been it's something to do with a loss of dopamine neurons in a part of the brain called, or in a pathway of the brain called the nigrostriatal pathway. Now, again, if you're like, oh, that is too much names, what is that? First of all, you could go back on the first video we did on dopamine and check out what I mean by the nigrostriatal pathway and whatnot. But simply put, it's a region of the brain, and it's a region deep inside the brain. In fact, let me see if I can just pull this thing up. So if I do that, oh, there you go, boom. So this is one of these images that I showed earlier on in the first live stream. And these are like two parts of the brain where dopamine originates from in the brain. So the VTA, the red thing, stands for the ventral tegmental area, so named because it's like at the roof, ventral tegment meaning roof, of this long elongated structure called the brain stem. So you can see it's the top of this long middle tube in the middle of the brain called the brainstem. And then there's the green part called the substantia nigra. And that is where you will see other parts of dopamine neuron, especially involved in Parkinson's. So in the green part, that's where the neurons related to Parkinson's originate, and it's thought that a dysfunction of this pathway is what is causing those movement symptoms in Parkinson's. So from the generic perspective, not just from the illness perspective, we know that dopamine is involved in movement. We know that dopamine is involved in vigor, like, feeling like you're energized and you want to move. And if you want to be motivated, if you want to have that long-term motivation towards a goal, chances are you need movement for that. And, that's one sort of loose connection between motivation and movement and dopamine, which is if you want to have those long-term goals and energy for those long-term goals, chances are you need the ability to move, and you need the ability to to have that let's go out and take some action. And so that's the role of dopamine in Parkinson's and in general movement. The second thing we're going to talk about, let me get the thing up. So the second thing we're going to talk about is addiction. And so again, recall last time we talked about the role of dopamine in learning. And we talked about how dopamine is more of a reinforcer. I also talked about how dopamine is not about pleasure. So it's possible that we think of dopamine as this pleasure molecule, right? That's like the common narrative about dopamine, that look, dopamine is a pleasure molecule. But we talked about that it might not be the case. But what seems to be the case is that dopamine is a bit of a reinforcer. So it's involved more in the wanting of a goal than the liking of a goal. And so with addictions, it may or may not be possible that there's a direct link with pleasure, but there seems to be a link with the wanting of more. So let's say if you have some addictive substance, then if you want it more, like you're like, give me more, like that chocolate, ooh, or that social media hit. And of course, there's extreme kinds of addictions, right? All sorts of drugs. So that's where the role of dopamine comes in. And so here the basic mechanism is actually just learning. So dopamine is simply involved in learning what's rewarding. So whatever is rewarding is what dopamine likes to reinforce. And this your brain learns with time. So if you want to reinforce something, the brain has developed this mechanism that I'm just going to release dopamine. So whatever is rewarding, I'm just like tempted to go for it more. And so that's how we can think of dopamine in terms of addiction, is that it's just this molecule that is asking us to do more, that it's taking and making us choose and make decisions that will give us the best possible outcome for the future. And again, a detailed description of the mechanism of this could be found in video 2, where I talked about this algorithm where dopamine is working like something like that. And I'm going to totally lose people here. But what essentially this is saying is the dopamine at a certain state, the value of a certain state is the value of the previous state plus the surprise that I get while I experience this new state. So again, the classic example is if you go to a restaurant and if you order a meal, and if you don't expect a lot from that meal, and the meal turns out to be like a Michelin star delicacy, then you're going to be like, wow, this is so good. And dopamine is going to learn to associate that reward with going to that place and whatnot. And therefore, you're going to crave going to that place much more. And of course, I'm talking about a meal, but you can replace that with any rewarding substance. And indeed, substances like drugs, like methamphetamines and others, they lead to these massive spikes of dopamine. And as a result, we crave them more. Like humans are designed to crave such substances a lot more. So hopefully that gives you a sense of dopamine in terms of its role in addiction, learning. And the next thing I want to talk about is schizophrenia. Now, perhaps out of all of these, this might be the least broad, but it's important to understand because there's a lot of talk in the neuroscience influencer world, the neuro-influencer world, let's say, about increasing dopamine, about, let's maximize our dopamine. But really, do we want to do that? And one reason for that is an increased hyperactivity in dopaminergic circuits is actually associated with schizophrenia. So first of all, if you have this illness, then hopefully it helps you understand where it comes from and to whatever it's worth, right? I obviously I'm not a psychiatrist, so do not take my anything I say in terms of practical advice, right? That you need to talk to a clinician. But the mechanism of this seems to be like a hyperactivity. So I'm just gonna write this: so a hyperactivity in the dopaminergic parts of the brain, and that seems to be involved with schizophrenia. And then uh, and then what we do know about it is the treatment. So the treatment actually leads to the decrease in these dopaminergic activities. So more specifically, the drugs that are often used as treatment for schizophrenia are used in are supposed to be blocking, in simple plain terms, the release of dopamine or the binding of dopamine to certain neurons. And they're called dopamine agonist if someone's interested in the technical word. But simply put, they are reducing the activity. They are blocking dopamine in the brain, and that's how one of the treatments of schizophrenia seems to be using these drugs. So again, that gives us a hint that dopamine is probably involved in delusional thoughts, or hallucination, depending again on the symptom. And again, schizophrenia has many symptoms, but the larger point I'm trying to make is we are constantly thinking of, dopamine increasing is good. And that seems to be the narrative all across. And really, we should be questioning that, because we do know that hyperactivity, increase in dopamine, is associated with negative symptoms in terms of schizophrenia, for example. And finally, this one is, I suppose, the least, at least the least understood, at least I understand the least in terms of the dopaminergic circuitry, and that is ADHD. Again, it stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And again, this is something that also tends to involve dopaminergic circuits. More specifically, the treatment for ADHD will also involve dopamine drugs. And whenever we are, there's also this link, I'll come back in a bit, where there's some studies that also show that closed-eyed forms of practices like yoga, meditation, introspection type practices, they do also lead to a slight increase in the dopamine in the brain, and therefore might help with things like ADHD. Now again, I'm gonna reserve a lot of comments with this, just because I'm not an expert in this area, but I do want to write it down at least, because it is one of those areas that are quite in popular, if I may say that, not in obviously sensational popular, but it seems to be the need of the hour that we understand ADHD and understand what the mechanisms are, so that we are able to help ourselves and help people in our communities. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some sense of the role of dopamine involved in clinical conditions. And so now I think the time has come to talk about how we are going to use dopamine to enhance our well-beings. And this is irrespective of any condition, perhaps more generic. And again, if you are on any sorts of medications or something, you should probably talk to a doctor. But so this is what the format will be when we talk about dopamine, and we talk about how do we increase dopamine, how do we leverage dopamine to increase our well-being, increase our energy, increase our motivation. So the first point I want to make is, why do we really need to think about dopamine? Like, why do we really need to increase dopamine, and why do we have to put the lens of dopamine on everything? And trust me, I say that as a neuroscientist. Excuse me. So one point I do want to make is, perhaps subjective experience is enough. Like, there is no need to think about, oh, I need to do this because it leads to an increase in dopamine. Like, you can simply do things because they feel good, or they feel like energizing, or they feel motivating. And I think sometimes we use these neuro phrases just out of nowhere. Like, I think there's I'm not sure if there's a study, but I did hear another neuroscientist talk about how people are more likely to trust you if you use neuroscientific words. So if you're going to say something like, oh, go out and exercise, as opposed to go out and exercise, it increases dopamine, then we are going to trust the dopamine version more. But we really don't want that. Like sure, with exercise, there is actually some evidence for dopamine, but even if it just felt good, and if you just said, go out and exercise, and it leads to a great feeling of elation and the rest of your day is good, I think that's equally good, and that's equally enough. And it avoids this trap of needing a scientific explanation, Because what happens in that trap is a lot of BS is peddled. So people just start using scientific words here and there, and may or may not have that scientific basis to whatever they are saying. Another thing worth saying is, as I said earlier, direct science does not directly translate into direct practice often. So, we talk about learning and how the role of dopamine in learning, that is hardcore science there. But then how do I really use it for my well-being? Like that's not hardcore science there, because those studies need to be done independently. And in general, we don't even know if more dopamine is better, right? So it's hard for just for you to just look at the science and be like, okay, now this is the prescription, right? So even if the scientific studies say that this is what you should do to increase dopamine, we should still have introspection. We should still have the subjective sense of whether this is truly for my health, whether it's truly going to improve my well-being, and take a informed guess based on that, not just because, oh, it led to some increase in dopamine. So having said that, and again, I would remind you that, is it really, like, let's say if you've self-diagnosed that, look, I have low dopamine, is it really worth increasing dopamine to its max? I don't know, because as I said earlier, a hyperactivity in dopamine is associated with illnesses like schizophrenia. So now perhaps that should not be just our goal, that we just keep on increasing our dopamine. Similarly, in the earlier section, I talked about how dopamine might be tracking the context. It might be tracking your environment. So if you are in an environment that has a lot of reward, then dopamine might be tracking that, and you might have higher baseline dopamine. Similarly, if you are in reward poor environments, you may have lower baseline dopamine, right? So now, if I were just to hack my dopamine, maybe by eating some of the dopaminergic foods, or perhaps by exercising, or whatever that is, or worse, even like, taking substances, sure, I might solve the dopamine problem, but I'm not solving the problem that the dopamine is representing. And perhaps the core problem is I'm in a context, I'm in an environment that is reward poor, that I'm not getting as many opportunities. So one example of that might be, you grow up in a very small town, but you have ambitions of, making it big in science, or making it big in finance, or making it big in politics, or whatever it is. And then feeling that a little bit of low dopamine in the environment that's not suitable might be a signal to change environments, not just a signal to increase dopamine. So hopefully all of you're getting a picture that, it's not as easy or straightforward as just, oh no, let's just increase dopamine and that's always good. No. First of all, increased dopamine may be associated with not so pleasant symptoms. And secondly, you might be missing the signal that the dopamine is giving. So, that's something to think about, and just something to be aware of. Yeah, I'm just going to quickly answer this question. Is increased dopamine associated, like if all of us increase dopamine, will that lead to schizophrenia? I don't know. So I think there's obviously a genetic component to it also. So it means that perhaps it's not just going to directly lead to schizophrenia, but it might lead to certain unpleasant symptoms at least. Similarly, even if it's just pure hyperactivity, even if you're just getting too hyper and too much energy, that's also perhaps just not good, right? Even if it doesn't trigger the official symptoms of schizophrenia. But the larger point I'm trying to make is this idea that just more is not better, and just increased is not the best. All right. So having said that, overall, you might look at dopamine, and if we are looking at increasing dopamine, then it might be worth trying if you have determined that, look, I don't think first of all, I'm not taking any massive substance, so the dopamine increase is not going to be massive. And secondly, I've seen people do these things and it seems like they improve their performance, cold showers, for example. So what are these kinds of things that are generally tried out in the world and they are considered healthy, let's say. And also they're associated with dopamine. So we're going to try and find that sweet spot. And I personally also do that. So just because some study has said this led to an increase in dopamine doesn't mean I try it out. Like that's not how at least I personally do things. But if I now see that, oh, look, at least a lot of athletes are doing it. And you know what? It doesn't sound too big a risk. Like if it's just like taking one cold shower, then I might try it and see how it feels. And then I might use my own personal subjective introspective experience to determine whether this is or is not for me. So in that realm, we are going to talk about a few things that are perhaps healthy, hopefully. Just align this with the camera. Boom, boom, boom. There you go. So let's just ensure that is happening. So we're going to talk about a few things and give you an overview of. So first of all will be food. So what are the kind of foods that we can take? And here specifically, I'm going to talk about this thing called tyrosine. And if you have been following my dopamine discussion, this tyrosine thing is very important because this is the precursor of dopamine. So dopamine doesn't come out of the blue. It's not a magical substance. You eat proteins, and tyrosine is an amino acid, which is part of all the protein that you eat. In fact, if you're the kind that does protein shakes, you can simply flip the protein shake, look at the label, and if it has a description of all the proteins, you will be able to see tyrosine in it, hopefully. The other thing we are going to talk about is things like caffeine. So I could put it in the food category, but it's such a common substance that I'm just going to give it a separate thing. The third thing we're going to talk about is self-awareness. And this is something I've been talking about already, but I'm going to make it a bit more formal here. The next thing we're going to talk about is things like social connection, sex, all of that lovely things. We'll also talk about exercise briefly. And these are all going to be like easy, straightforward things, not going to be too long. We're going to talk about this thing called dopamine fasting or dopamine detox is something that's going to come up again and again. And I'm not saying this is necessarily true or you should do it, right? I'm just listing down the things that we should talk about today. We're going to talk, oh, wow, I might be outside of screen. Oops. There you go. And then we're going to talk about meditation. These are all related to, how do you use dopamine to increase our well-being? I have a couple more. So let's do it here, maybe, hopefully. We are going to talk about cold showers. And we are going to talk about UV radiation. Well, I don't know. I went lowercase there. But that's the lay of the land for today. That's what we're going to try and cover to help you increase your dopamine, help you boost your motivation and vigor. And there's and see what the science says about some of these things. So let's do this. So you're back here. So in one of the earlier episodes, I talked about how dopamine is created. And if I bring up this thing again, the dopamine originates in these parts of the brain. And especially in, these two nuclei called the ventral tegmental area, substantia nigra. These parts of the brain produce the dopamine in the brain, but how do they get here? And what is the raw material for dopamine? And this raw material tends to be, let me bring this up, tends to be this thing called tyrosine. Now, tyrosine is an amino acid found in proteins. And whenever you eat tyrosine, that is converted into multiple things, which ultimately ends up as dopamine. And so if you do eat foods that are rich in tyrosine, aka if you have protein in your diet, which you should, not just for dopamine reasons, but generally it's a good thing to have in your diet, to have a balanced diet. So if you do that, you will experience an increase in some baseline levels of dopamine. And indeed, there's also some anecdotal evidence. So again, this is not like real science, but purely anecdotally, I've known people who have taken tyrosine as a supplement. They experience like an increase in focus, which speaks to the ADHD point we were talking about earlier, and just an overall sort of productivity boost by taking tyrosine as a supplement. Now, again, by no means am I suggesting you should do that, and I actually don't do it myself. But it is just for your information and for so that you know. But I definitely encourage you to take protein, like healthy proteins, like lean meats, or if you're vegetarian, then tofu and whatnot. And obviously, you can supplement with protein shakes, and that will certainly lead to this abundance of this molecule called tyrosine in your bloodstream, which is obviously the precursor to dopamine. This is the raw material, this is the building blocks that are needed to create dopamine. And so just to now examine, like, are there any studies that look at, what happens if people take tyrosine, if there's any benefits to that? So again, we don't have too much time to cover every single thing, but there's this study by this first author, the name is Thomas. And what they showed is that people who were taking tyrosine saw an increase in their working memory. So imagine, you have to do a task which involves working memory. And working memory, if you don't know what that is, think of it like as a computer with a hard disk and a RAM. So a hard disk is more like the permanent memory. That's where everything is stored. But the random access memory, the RAM of a computer, is where things that are needed to store, that things that might be needed immediately or things that you're working on currently might be stored. So if I have these YouTube right now open on my screen, the browser that's running YouTube is perhaps stored in RAM, or the processes with that, so that it can be easily retrieved. Similarly, humans have working memory where, we can easily retrieve things, and it's, the things that we need actively for the task we are performing. And so they found that people who took tyrosine led to an increase in this sort of a working memory. There's various tasks you can do to figure out what people's memory contains. And they found that people who were taking tyrosine led to an increase in working memory. So it might be something, well, again, note to self, I'm going to refrain from saying, you should do it, because again, that's not my position to say, but my position is to tell you what the science is or what the mechanism might be. All right. Again, personally, on a personal note, I've never supplemented with tyrosine myself, but I do ensure that I take enough of protein in my diet, perhaps a bit more than what the regular requirements are, but I also work out, and there are other reasons to do that. So you might experience, so other benefits of protein include that, if your muscles are naturally degrading over time, so even if you don't exercise, just by the process of aging, your muscles are going to degrade over time. And what protein does is helps protect against that degeneration. So there are plenty of other reasons to ensure that you're getting the adequate amount of protein in your diet. So that was number 1. Let's go back to this. Number 2, caffeine. Now, a lot of people will be like, woohoo, caffeine made the list. And yeah, it made the list. And indeed, consumption of coffee or yerba mate tea or whatever you want to drink. Like my personal thing is green tea / matcha. That's my caffeine hit of choice. That has been shown and linked to an increase in dopamine. And obviously I don't have to tell you that, but if you take caffeine, that definitely leads to us, like feelings of awakeness or energy or productivity. Indeed, the world takes it. One thing that might be worth saying is that we forget that caffeine is a drug. And it's no coincidence that it has this effect on the human body, and it is a very powerful substance indeed for productivity and whatnot. Personally, I do also take coffee for jet lag and things like that. It does help me restart and reset my circadian rhythm. But again, personal. Having said that, personally, I'm not also. I'm making it sound as if I'm a big coffee drinker, which I'm not. But I do occasionally consume caffeine as and when needed, strategically, as it were. Awesome. So just checking everything is good. So, in terms of studies, there's a study published in the Journal of Neuroscience in 2002. The author's name is Salinas. This is probably the last author name that I've noted down. And they have made a very direct link. They have shown a very direct link between caffeine and the increase of dopamine. So, the group that consumed caffeine had increased levels of dopamine. And it's as straightforward as it gets. Now, of course, in general, I keep on saying that one study should not necessarily tell you everything and may even tell you nothing, because there are always biases and errors in science. But what I do want to say is the way I am making these decisions for myself is, I'm looking at the studies, but I'm also looking at, do people normally take it, and does that lead to any massive consequences? If not, and if generally might lead to people report good things about it, then maybe it's okay and maybe it's worth trying. But again, if you have any problems, consult your doctor. Oops. Then we are now going to talk about, we already have been talking about, so not going to go too much into detail, but self-awareness. And the reason why I bring up self-awareness is not that this leads to an increase in dopamine or whatnot, but it was to again say that just because a scientific study said so doesn't mean you have to do so. And the reason for that is normally science does not investigate direct end-to-end applications. Science, at least the neuroscience bit that I do, it's more focused on the fundamental mechanisms. And whether or not it translates into applications is a separate study that needs to be done. So the reason why I've noted caffeine and food for tyrosine, because there are these studies that directly test tyrosine and its improvement in whatever we want to be improved. But there might be other things that may not have that effect, and we need to be careful about that. So self-awareness, feeling your body and seeing whether it feels healthy or not, and whether it is healthy or not, is quite important. So I'll leave it at that, because I've banged that drum multiple times. Social connection. Now, again, it should be no secret to you that social connection activities that we do with people do feel rewarding, and we want to do them more often. So again, it's something that we all do, and I don't need to explain too much, but going outside with friends, it's perhaps one of the most rewarding things that we ever do in life. Then there's also things like romantic or interpersonal one-on-one sort of deep relationships. There's obviously physical acts which are extremely pleasurable, sexual acts, or it could be non-sexual physical intimacy like cuddling and hugging and kisses on the cheek and whatnot. And all of those, social connection in general, seems to be linked with a release of dopamine, and seems to be rewarding for our well-being. So again, to look into some studies that might suggest that is the case, because we don't just believe, we also look at studies and we look at the science. There's this link between generally social connection being very reinforcing. So I suppose for social connection, I'm going to go a bit beyond dopamine and talk about this thing called the social brain hypothesis, which is a hypothesis that our brains have evolved this complex features, these abilities, this beautiful, like intelligent system has evolved basically for social connection, or to solve social problems is more accurate way of saying it. So this part of social connection perhaps goes beyond dopamine, and of course there's that element of social connection is rewarding, but there's this larger idea that the brain itself might have evolved for social connection, social cooperation, bonding, problem solving, and whatnot. And in terms of like specifics, there's one of the more sort of fascinating studies on this is done by it's from UPenn. It's Michael Platt is one of the authors in it, and the study shows that monkeys are willing to sacrifice rewards like fruit juices in exchange for just seeing photos of other monkeys. So the paper is called Monkeys Pay-Per-View, and just reinforces this idea that social connection might be like this fundamental need that oftentimes we're even willing to sacrifice for just for just seeing the faces of others. We are willing to sacrifice some tangible rewards like fruit juices and food in general. So I thought that was a fascinating study to mention here. Okay, cool. We're going to talk about exercise. Now, exercise is also linked to an increase in dopamine. So, to talk about the exact study I have in front of me, this is a study published in Brain Science 2023. Marquez is supposedly the name of the last author. I might have made a mistake in noting that down. But they showed, so this is like a review, which means it's not just one study, but they have taken a bunch of studies and they have looked at all the studies and see what they're doing, and they've tried to write like a story around all the stories, all the studies that have come up in this exercise realm. And they've looked at like 15 articles in this study, so 15 different studies hopefully, and they show that physical activity, otherwise known as exercise, led to an increase in dopamine levels. So again, perhaps it's no surprise to you, but it's good when the science is clear, and especially when there's evidence stacking upon each other. That's when at least I develop more and more certainty about something being the case or not. And indeed, 15 studies reviewed, that definitely makes me think that's a real effect there. And again, even if there was none, we know that exercise feels good. It releases endorphins apart from dopamine, and it is indeed rewarding. So it's something that we do, and not only that, but it's associated with healthy outcomes like better aging, perhaps longer life, better cardiovascular health, and whatnot. So this is the kind of thing that I look at when I think of whether I should adopt this in my life. Does it have this holistic sense of evidence? Is there anecdotal evidence? Is there like people who are living longer, are they doing that? Is there studies that show that? And that's the self-awareness bit that I was telling you earlier. And this is how I decide whether or not to implement something in my life. Just because there was some neuromolecule increase somewhere, that personally for me is not enough, because studies can have bias and whatnot. Okay, and speaking of bias and fake science and no studies to back something up, I'm going to talk about this thing called dopamine detox, which also has a sub form of digital detox. And another phrase that used is dopamine fasting. And we're going to talk about that, but I'm going to get a sip of water before that. How is everybody doing? Is this useful? I hope it is. And I hope it's somewhat more practical and applicable and whatnot. Again, the beauty of these lives is that you get to hear all my behind the scenes, this ASMR water sound and whatnot. Okay. Water break done. Water break done. Let's see, I'm a bit out of the frame right here. There we go. Okay. So now that so we're going to speak about digital keep saying digital detox, but I want to say dopamine detox. So one of the things that you might hear about dopamine when you're searching the internet is this idea of a dopamine detox, otherwise known as dopamine fasting, or digital detox as a sub form of dopamine detox, if that's sometimes. And it does sound like a very intriguing idea on its head, right? So think about things like addictions. Think about, if you're on social media and, you're sort of addicted to doom scrolling, and, there's this TikTokification of the human brain that's happening, where it's very hard to get people to pay attention to long things. And, and I mean, I'm suffer from this where, what I'm trying to do in this world is create this detailed, longer guides. But when you look at the statistics, it's much more sort of easier from a views perspective to make like a TikTok video, and even make that video the most like high dopamine sort of video ever. Like put all sorts of naked photos and semi naked photos, if that's not allowed, and make all sorts of other sound effects and VFX come in, and that sort of video will get more views. But perhaps it's not good for us. And as one of the solutions for this, one of the things that keeps coming up is we need to go on a dopamine detox. Our attention spans are fried, and the logic goes, our we don't have the ability to focus, and so why not get into a detox? And in theory that sounds wonderful, but I hated to break it to you, but at least I haven't found any evidence of dopamine detox as being like a legitimate thing to do. Like, and this is not to say that it does not work, by the way. This is the distinction I'm trying to draw. This is not to say that it does not work, but it is to say that there's no direct scientific evidence for it. And people talk about it as if there is, as if, it's like a well-established thing that a dopamine detox will lead to a reset of dopamine, and therefore all your problems are solved. And unfortunately, there's no direct science, at least in digital or dopamine detox, that I have found. And even if there is that, there's this one-off study, it's clearly not like an established multi-study thing. So for whatever it's worth, there's no direct evidence of that. Having said that, this is not to say it's all meaningless or all BS, because there is some element of truth to it in terms of if we think about the mechanisms of dopamine. So if you recall earlier, we talked about how dopamine is a reinforcer. And the corollary to that, the other side of that, the flip side of that, is that if you take away the reward, then it does lead to a suppression of dopamine, and eventually you lose that association with that thing. So in terms of those shorter time scales, that is indeed true. And so if you just extend that now over the course of months, maybe what we can say is that detox, or that refraining from things, might lead to that reset, or might, well, in that case will certainly lead to a unlearning of that association, right? But here's the thing. Addictions and things that we consume are not that straightforward. Like if it were just a matter of, oh, I just grayscale my phone and that's it, then it would be easier, right? But the reality of it is it's very painful, and it is possible that we might be masking some of the other issues by substituting it with something else. So for example, internally I might be feeling lonely and upset and worried, and maybe my way of coping with that is going on Instagram and doom scrolling. In that case, the grayscaling of the phone or deleting of the app is perhaps not going to be as useful, because that is not getting at the core problem. And that is why precisely we need clinicians. That is why we just don't have like algorithms that make decisions for you. Because in the clinical context, in the context of wanting to improve our behavior, well, it could be non-clinical as well, excuse me. In those sorts of contexts, we need to think about the rest of the human as well. And that's why I find, like when people go online and they talk about, oh, the solution to your problems is a dopamine detox. Maybe, but maybe not. And to make it feel that it is science is, I think, incorrect. So hopefully that gives you a sense of where we are with the whole dopamine detox thing. Having said that, once again, I'm not trying to say it's all BS and never useful. Indeed, psychiatrist Anna Lemke, who's written the book Dopamine Nation, she talks about how she deals with her patients when they have what she suspects is a dopamine type problem, and detox or refraining from doing that thing that is rewarding might be part of that solution. So again, it's something in the arsenal. So the way I think of it is it's another bow in your bag. But it's just one of the bows, and may or may not be the right bow. Oh, well, it's one of the arrows is what should have said, but it might not be one of the arrows that you use, and it's just one of those arrows in the arsenal, and you can use whichever one you think might be appropriate, and some arrows might not be appropriate in some situations. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what dopamine detox is, and you're not too fooled by the neuro influencers out there. Speaking of neuro influencers, and I suppose I'm one of them now, so I have to be a bit careful about uh, talking ill of them. But one thing to talk about in terms of pop neuroscience that I think is quite incorrect is people say that, you have to wake up in the morning and you have to do the first thing that you want to do in the morning, because otherwise later on you will not have enough dopamine available to you. And this is no joke, by the way. This is something that's a relatively popular video in one of those short form websites. And to that, I'm going to call BS. There is nothing that I know of, at least, that suggests that you have more dopamine in the morning and less in the night. And even if there is, it's very hard to go from that to translating into, okay, therefore do all your work in the morning. Clearly there are chronotypes, meaning some people are more morning birds, other people are less evening owls, and people have different work preferences, and people have different energies at different points in the day. It also obviously depends on the food and whatnot. So apologies. So just this idea that, dopamine refreshes in sleep and then it just goes away with time, that's absolutely not true. And in fact, again, you eat food, there's constant replenishing going on. So at least I don't think there's direct evidence to support that, you should just first thing whenever you wake up is the maximum dopamine sort of realm. And of course, you're most rested. So there are other reasons perhaps, but to give it just a dopamine label because it just goes down like you have a limited store of it, that's probably untrue. And there's a constant replenishing of dopamine going on in your brain throughout the day. Right. So we talked about that. Now we're going to talk about meditation. And here there is some evidence to suggest that dopamine and meditation are linked. And indeed, meditating for a bit can lead to an increase in dopamine. So there are obviously various styles of meditation. So I'm not going to talk about every single one of them because that's a video of its own. But one of the more clearer evidence comes from this style of meditation / yoga / practice is yoga nidra. Now I know, again, Huberman and there are other people who have done a more secular version of this called non-sleep deep rest. If you look at the mechanics of it, it's not too different than any other style of meditation, for example, that looks like body scanning, for example. So that's why I'm comfortable grouping this as meditation. Of course, though, the study I have in front talks about this yoga nidra style of meditation or non-sleep deep rest, if that's what you prefer. And this is a study done by Kaher is probably the name. I'm totally butchering the pronunciation, but KJAER is what I've noted down. 2002 study where it said that this meditation style was linked to a 65% increase in endogenous dopamine release. So that is endogenous meaning just inside. So 65%, that's something. And again, to me, just looking at that is probably not enough, because what does it translate into in terms of day-to-day experience? But it also seems like meditation is something personally I've done so often that I feel it. Like, I think I understand what that means. But again, when you do it, I think I invite you to not just look at the study, but look at, are people doing it? Does it generally seem healthy? Does it seem like it will benefit me, and so on? And so that is something that does have some evidence for, and therefore it makes it to this list. I think the only thing here that I'm skeptical about is this one, and then everything else is quite cool. Hopefully you can still see my screen. Yeah. So that's meditation, and we've covered that bit. The next thing we're going to talk about is cold showers. Let's go. And so cold showers is another one of those new age sort of things that have becoming really popular in the recent past. And again, indeed, there are some studies that suggest that cold water immersion might be useful for increasing dopamine levels to perhaps even enhance recovery. So just coming back here on the screen for a bit. So one study that comes for cold showers comes out of Prague, where Sramek is Sramek, again, may not be pronouncing correct, is the name of the last author or last name of the first author, if I'm remembering correctly. And they showed that cold showers led to a dopamine increase. So if you are immersing yourself in cold water, I'm guessing it also applies to that. It will lead to an increase in dopamine. And they also showed, I think, that the dopamine effect lasts for a few hours. So it's not just, instantaneous hit, but there is this a little bit of sustained energy and vigor that comes out of cold showers. Now, personally, in my routine, I have been taking cold showers for a number of years. This is not like all cold, by the way. It's taking a normal regular shower and then ending it with a few seconds, maybe 30 seconds to a minute of cold water, and that definitely wakes me up at the very least. And on the days that I do it, I do feel better, and the days that I do not do it, I do not feel as good. Having said that, the difference is not night and day, and I can totally function without it as well. But that's been one of the ways I have decided to structure my start of the day, is to have a little bit of cold exposure in the morning. And for me, at least, this goes on irrespective of what the weather is like. So I've taken cold showers in like negative temperatures. I've taken cold showers in scorching heat, and it's just been a routine. It doesn't matter too much to me. It's just a thing. But of course, when you do it initially, you're gonna feel scared. You're gonna feel uncomfortable, and that's also one reason why I like cold showers. Is apart from all this conversation about dopamine, it is useful to develop a relationship with discomfort. So whatever goals you might have in life, whatever long-term goals and motivations that you might have in life, for that, the chances are it's going to involve some amount of discomfort. And so cold showers for me has been one of this practice where I practice facing discomfort every day. So even if it were not linked to dopamine, to me it has value because I am practicing stepping into discomfort actively. So the message that I'm trying to give myself is, if there is discomfort, then that does not mean I necessarily avoid it. And there might even be times where I step into it. So for me, it has this nice ritualistic value as well. But of course, it also helps to have the science behind it. And again, it speaks to my earlier point of not just thinking of, oh, one study said this, therefore I'm doing it, but think about the study as one of the crucial inputs to the larger decision making frameworks that are driven by your values. All right. So that's basically it. And of course, to speak to the larger point, cold showers will probably also lead to energy and vigor because dopaminergic circuits are associated with that. And so the final thing I would say to wrap, and this is the part I wrote down here about UV radiation, and this is the red flag here, by the way, just to not confuse the list as all good things. But there is a study that suggests, and the reason I'm talking about this is because to make this point of increase in dopamine does not necessarily mean that it's a good thing. And earlier I talked about how schizophrenia is associated with increased dopamine. In this study, they showed that something that we know is unhealthy for us, which is UV radiation, causes all sorts of problems. They show that UV radiation led to also an increase in dopamine. So meaning there's no direct relationship between things that are healthy for us and an increase in dopamine. And that's another reason why we should be careful about just simply wanting to increase dopamine. Like, why? It's assumed that more dopamine is better, but that clearly is not the case. And so in this study, this is by Woon is the last name of the first author, and it's a 2024, so a fairly recent study. And they show that chronic ultraviolet radiation, meaning repeated long-term exposure to ultraviolet radiation, which we get normally through sunlight, it was linked to an increase in dopamine. But of course, UV radiation is not good for us. So that doesn't necessarily mean that anything that increases dopamine is good for us. And hopefully this study helps to make that point. And if you're wondering that, oh, but it's probably because these mice were exposed to sunlight, that's why they felt good. And it's actually the feeling good that lead to an increase in dopamine. Aha, the scientists did think about it, and it was not sunlight exposure. It was specifically isolated UV light exposure that led to that increase in dopamine. So hopefully, I do appreciate the scientific thinking, but the authors were one step ahead in this experiment. So well done to them. We're done. Woohoo! And I just want to wrap by talking about what's the moral of the story here. And the moral of the story is dopamine. We have been talking about dopamine for quite a while. Dopamine is important. It's clearly one of the the most critical neurotransmitters that drives us. And it might be possible, it might be useful to increase dopamine in some situations. Having said that, we should not do it blindly. And we should try to make a decision based on many, many factors, including our values. And if you have any problems, then perhaps a doctor is involved in this decision making and whatnot. Consulting other experts and whatnot. But hopefully this lay of the land for today help you understand how do you increase dopamine and how it might help you to increase your productivity, increase your focus, increase your energy, increase your long-term motivation. So if you do try out any of that, let me know how it goes. Again, be wise and take clinical advice if and when needed. Take expert advice if and when needed. But generally, these things hopefully should not create too many problems, at least. And that is dopamine. Thanks for sticking with me. We have covered a large ground with dopamine. So what I'm going to do in the last few minutes of today's live stream, and well, if you're watching the recording, it's the recording, is summarize this vast area of dopamine that I've covered over 3 weeks now, over hours and hours. And to my mind, this is the most comprehensive content on dopamine on the internet. And luckily, I have all these figures that I have drawn on this nice little. Apologies for keeping shaking the mic all the time, but it's the cost of doing many things at once and the cost of trying to get everything running. So let me try and get the first thing out, but hopefully this was useful. Let me know if anything was not, and if you are watching later on, you can always comment or email or whatever. So I have a little bit of summary for you based on all these lovely things we have drawn and thought about. So dopamine, who am I? Okay, so we, in this sort of 3-part thing, what we talked about is we talked about dopamine, we talked about how it works, which includes its structure and its function, and we talked about what it does. And then finally, well, I did talk about who am I as well, but in the final section, we talked about how do we use it to improve our focus, improve our well-being, and so on. So well, that's probably not it. Now I see what's happening. I looked at actually an earlier slide. It's actually this one. All right. Restart this thing. So we talked about what is dopamine, we talked about what it does, and we talked about how to use it for motivation, vigor, and energy. The earlier slide, if you saw that, was just me practicing. Okay, so we talked about brains, and every cell in the brain, well, many cells in the brain look like that. This is the primary brain cell. It's called the neuron. And if you were to zoom inside a brain, you would find cells like these. And a neuron is connected to other neurons, but it's not like physically joined. It's not like physically touching each other. There's a small gap between every neuron. This gap is called the synapse. And in this synapse is where dopamine is released. So dopamine is a neuromodulator, as we call it, because it's released throughout the brain in multiple parts, and it's released between neurons. So it's released in the gap called the synapse, or more technically, the synaptic cleft. Then we talked about the different pathways of dopamine. So since it's a neuromodulator, it's present in various parts of the brain. And really, dopamine starts in these two key nuclei in the midbrain. This is the midbrain. The one key nuclei is the substantia nigra. The other key nucleus is the ventral tegmental area. The substantia nigra marked by a cross here sends some projections, otherwise known as neurons. So there's think of it like a dopamine highway. And this dopamine highway goes to this part of the brain in the front called the striatum. Then there's the ventral tegmental area, which also sends neurons to another part of the striatum, the nucleus accumbens being a very key part here. And then there's other neurons that go right to the front of the brain. That's where your decision making, your higher order thinking, and all of those are residing. So this pathway, this from the cross to the striatum, is called the nigrostriatal pathway. This pathway is called the mesocortical pathway. Well, this pathway is called the mesolimbic pathway, and this pathway is called the mesocortical pathway. Hopefully that makes sense. And then this was in my view, this is the key figure. So I'm gonna try and position it correctly before yapping on. This is really the key. This gives you the key idea about dopamine. So it's about, we think of dopamine as involving in these things, right? Pleasure, we think about learning, we think about motivation and environment. Pleasure, I've just written it down because it's actually a false positive. Most people think that dopamine is a pleasure molecule, but there's actually very little evidence to suggest that it's about pleasure. And again, in the video, I went into detail about why that might be the case, but for now, I'm just going to leave it that dopamine is probably not involved in pleasure. Then we talked about learning and decision making. We talked about reinforcement learning as a key algorithm that leads to that explains how dopamine is released in the brain. We talked about motivation and how there's a signal in dopamine that ramps up as we get closer to our goals. And this sort of a signal might be involved in the pursuit of these longer horizon goals, where dopamine is this tracking this longer horizon goals. And then we talked about how dopamine might be involved in representing the environment, the context that you're in. And it might be representing the average rate of reward in that environment. So that's the best summary I could give you about dopamine. We talked about some experiments with a rat and how these are dopamine deprived rats and they still go for pleasurable things as evidence. I talked about this massive study that showed how dopamine worked and how it might be tracking surprise and learning, not exactly pleasure. Again, a detailed explanation of this is somewhere else. Look up the description or the comments or something. They talked about some mathematical functions that dopamine might be doing in the brain. Do not worry. This is easy math and it's worth it. We talked about where in the body and the brain that these computations might be happening. We talked about the exact motivation study where they discovered this ramping signal in mice. We talked about phasic and tonic dopamine, so the different functions that dopamine has in the brain. Phasic being like hits, like dopamine hits. Tonic being like the slow release of dopamine, the background hum. We talked about some more studies then. And then finally, we talked about how to use dopamine to increase our well-being. But before we talked about that, we talked about the relevance of dopamine in in illnesses or ill health. And we talked about a few illnesses where dopamine seems to play a role. So Parkinson's, we talked about movement, we talked about addiction, we talked about schizophrenia, talked about ADHD. And finally, we concluded by talking about how do we use dopamine to increase our motivation, well-being, and whatnot. And for that, we went to this lovely list in detail and talked about some studies that are involved with these lists. And so the list is laid out for you. I'm not going to go over each again, but hopefully this gives you a sense of how do we put all the theory that we learned in practice. So I just want to thank you for being with me. If you have been watching all the 3 dopamine videos, that's like ninja. And I admire your dedication to learning about science. It's not easy. This is hard stuff. And I've tried my best to not hold back things from you and to explain the science in as accessible a way as possible and as meaningful a way as possible, and also hopefully as practical a way as possible. So hopefully this was useful. And the only thing that I want to conclude with is to talk about the 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 necessity, the invitation that I have for you to engage with this long, difficult stuff. It's too easy now to have like quick stimulus. It's too easy to have like bite-sized information. But I don't think that's where true knowledge is built. I don't think that's where reality is understood. I don't think that's where true satisfaction is gained. And I want to invite you to prioritize learning this hard, long, and difficult stuff. At least that's my commitment these days, is to put out these long and difficult stuff, even if it means fewer people are watching it, even if it means that I'm not as popular and I could sacrifice on that. That's totally okay. But to me, I'm just developing this sense that even if one person watches this in detail, it's much better than people just simply watching like a 1 minute video, which doesn't really say much. So prioritizing depth and quality in what I'm creating, and I feel I'm uniquely qualified to do this. So I'm happy to be in this position, and hopefully you're happy to be with me and learn about these cool things about the brain. In the next few episodes, let me just stop the recording here. In the next few episodes, what I'm going to try and do is talk about neuroscience as a broad stroke thing. So the video topic I have in mind is every part of your brain explained. So we're going to go through like different parts of the brain and talk about what they do and try to paint a picture of the brain. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for everyone who joined. Thanks, Shani. Thanks, everybody else for sticking with me and for joining this. There were like a lot of people today, like more than 15. So that's good. And this is just live, by the way. Of course, there will be hundreds later. So I love that. Again, I love your dedication to science. I love your dedication to everything that I do here, and your curiosity to learn about your brain, because that is running the show. And to understand the brain is to truly understand yourself, and it's one of the biggest privileges of my life to be studying the brain in the position that I do. All right, then it's time to say goodbye. Thank you for joining me in the stream. I will try and make it next time, probably the same time. So see you hopefully next week. You will see notifications and whatnot. You'll see a scheduled stream. And again, if you are interested in going slightly deeper, then I have a scorecard that you can take. It's on your screen in the pinned comments. So if I just share my screen very briefly, hopefully you're seeing my screen right now. And this is a scorecard I created. It measures your emotional intelligence and gives you recommendations on what to improve and what to not. It's completely free of cost. If you're truly interested, I also invite you to join my school community. And this is where first of all, you'll see all the schedule of my live streams and whatnot, but you will also get like feedback from me. We do like live check-ins. We do like journaling exercises and whatnot. So it's something I'm experimenting with. This part is not free, but it does involve a lot of courses, and my flagship course on emotional intelligence is like a long course on my framework of emotional intelligence. Worth checking out if you're interested. It's not that expensive at all. So I'm gonna paste this link in the comments if anyone wants to check it out. But other than that, the link will also be in the description. Let me save you some eye strain there. So, okay. Hopefully you had fun. Hopefully, thanks for joining me. And we'll continue on this neuroscience pursuit, continue on this pursuit of depth next time. Thank